Hey everybody, I'm Brad Soloto. I'm a recovered alcoholic. Kevin's away today, so he's asked me to fill in for him. So you're stuck with me today. Welcome, and I'm glad you're all here. I'm happy to see you all again this week as I'm traveling and away from home. So it's always good to see a bunch of friendly faces. Um, for those who would care to, I'm going to start off with the set aside prayer. I love the set aside prayer for big book studies because it reminds me that I have much to learn, and if I don't remain open minded, I will be stuck with my old ideas. So the set aside prayer goes like this: God, today help me set aside everything I think and know about you, everything I think and know about myself, everything I think and know about others, and everything I think and know about my own recovery, so I may have an open mind and a new experience with all these things. Please help me see the truth. Amen. And as this is the fourth dimension big book study, we like to start off by reading the two places in our book where it talks about the fourth dimension and being rocketed into the fourth dimension. So the first is on page 8. Um, Partway down, I've heard of in the middle of the book, it says, in reality, that was the beginning of my last debauch. I was soon to be catapulted into what I like to call the fourth dimension of existence. I was to know happiness, peace, and usefulness in a way of life that is incredibly more wonderful as time passes. So that's on page 8. And then on page 25, um, it says, here we go. We have found that much of heaven we have found much of heaven, and we have been rocketed into a fourth dimension of existence of which we had not even dreamed. So that's where our book talks about, the fourth dimension, and that's where this study gets its name. Back to the actual book, we are picking up where we left off last week, which was page XV, or Roman numeral 15. Which is on the first page of the foreword to the second edition. So last week we went through the preface and the foreword to the first edition, and then we got started, just barely started on the foreword to the second edition. And this one really has, it's kind of a little bit longer than the rest of them, and it has a lot of the history of AA in here. So I think it's really important and key. We learned that a little bit of the history and really the miracle of how AA came together, where we got to figure out this one person became the first person in the history of mankind to understand what the problem is and where it came from. He understood and had the knowledge of what the solution was, and then also what the program of action was. And that man was Bill Wilson, and so for the first time, somebody had all of the pieces of that puzzle that are important to me and that I need to get sober and to maintain sobriety. And so that's kind of the miracle. And the miracle of it is some of those things came from halfway around the world, and all three of them came from non-alcoholics, right? None of them came from alcoholics. So that's kind of the cool part to it. So we are on page XV, and we're near the bottom of the page that says the spark. So really what has happened is, we talked about in the first part of this, in the 16 years since the printing of the first edition. The first edition, it tells us earlier in the book that they printed 300,000 copies, and 16 years later, they've sold 300,000 copies of the first edition of the big book, and there's about 150,000 recovered alcoholics in the world. So just based on book sales and recoveries, it sounds like somewhere around 50% success rate in people getting sober, which we can't claim things like stats like that anymore. So near the bottom of the page, it says the spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician. 6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day. He had also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages, right? So that friend was Ebby Thatcher, and Ebby Thatcher brought some of the stuff he had learned from Roland Hazard, really, and the Oxford Group, right? So Ebby Thatcher comes to see him, and Ebby Thatcher understands what the solution is, right? Which was a spiritual solution, and he understands what the program of action is from the Oxford groups. Back then it was these 6 steps that eventually evolved into our 12 steps. And Bill Wilson has already, from Dr. Silkworth, learned the grave nature of our problem, right? He learned what alcoholism is, so he knew what the problem was. So after meeting with Ebby Thatcher, now Bill Wilson now has all 3 pieces of the puzzle, right? And he had been sober about 6 months when he then goes to Akron on this business deal, and he comes into contact with and meets Dr. Bob, right? And when Dr. Bob gets sober on June 10th, 1935, we say that's Founders Day, and that was day 1 of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. So from this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism, right? He understood what the problem was. Though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford group, he is convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personal defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and dependence upon God, right? So he couldn't accept all of the stuff the Oxford group was doing. And remember, the Oxford group had nothing to do with alcoholism. It was a group of people that were trying to live on the same moral ground and in the same way as first century Christians. So people from 0 to 100 AD, what were their Christian values at that time? And so the Oxford group was really trying to mimic or live as though they were in the first 100 years, right? So they had these steps that they did to try and grow closer to God. And AA adopted, like it says, we couldn't accept all of the tenets of the Oxford group, but AA accepted. And if you look in the chat, Rob's posted, what those 6 steps were at that time. And they're very much, just I think broader versions of what evolved into our 12 steps. Because when they went to publish the book, they wanted to, I've heard that they didn't want to leave any wiggle room. They had to define those steps much more clearly, right? So when they went to write the book, it came out to be 12 steps. So prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he had succeeded only in keeping himself sober. The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, right? So Bill came from New York City to Akron, and he'd spent 6 months sober. And during that time, he was running around trying to help other alcoholics get sober. And at that time, we didn't know anything different between, was it now we talk about being a spiritual program, but, back in that day, none of that had been really decided yet or sorted out or understood. So he's running around New York City for 6 months telling people that, they've got to find God and God is the solution. And, and he's preaching to people, and he's had 0 success in helping anyone get sober in 6 months. And he's very down in the dumps, and he's frustrated, and he thinks that, that he's kind of ready to give up. But the Oxford group said, you have to carry this message to others, right? And so he's kind of ready to give up. And he has 2 conversations. One was with his wife, Lois, and he says, I'm just not able to help anybody get sober. And Lois says, no, that's not true. You've stayed sober. You've never stayed sober for 6 months. So it is working. Whatever you're doing is working, right? So don't give up. And Dr. Silkworth also told him that he should, instead of going around and trying to tell people they've got to get God, he should share with them what Dr. Silkworth had shared with them, and share with them the grave nature of their illness, and that it was, this uh, obsession of the mind and this physical allergy, right? And share with them what it was about, and share with them the hopeless nature of the disease and what the solution was, right? And so he goes off to Akron on this business deal. The business deal goes very bad. He's pacing the hotel lobby in the Mayflower Hotel, and he's looking for, there's this off to the side, there's this bar with this happy sound inside, and he's drawn towards this bar and thinking maybe he could just go in and have a Coke or a pop, and then maybe he thinks maybe a couple of drinks wouldn't hurt, right? And he thinks that and he starts to have these thoughts, and that mental obsession starts to kick in, and he recognizes it. And so he then, I think full of fear, finds the payphone at the end of the lobby and starts phoning numbers, and eventually through a series of phone calls and connections ends up connected with Dr. Bob, right? That's, I guess, a little bit of his history. And that's, it says, so he realized that he must, in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic. That alcoholic turned out to be the Akron physician, which was Dr. Bob. This physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. In fact, Dr. Bob was already a member of the Oxford group, right? But he didn't know what his problem was. He didn't really know what the solution was, right? He didn't understand all three parts of that. So he was unable, although he was already going to the Oxford group, he was unable to get sober. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and its hopelessness, the physician began to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with the willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950. This seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery, right? I just remembered I have this that I should share with you guys. Basically, the description of these things that we're talking about. If I share this, just bear with me. It disappeared. Sorry. I just had I'm going to stop sharing. I was going to show you essentially what the three things were, just sort of written on Kevin's whiteboard, but they disappeared on my computer. So basically, though, that was what I'd said. So so yeah. So prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory. Oh yeah, I read that part. Sorry. So he goes and he meets Dr. Bob, right? And Dr. Bob gets sober. So at the top of XVII, it says, hence the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3. He never had another drink, right? So you guys have all been in the AA rooms where there's the picture of the two guys in the chairs and the guy sitting on the bed. Everybody familiar with that picture? That's AA number 3. That's Bill Dodson. So he's known as the man on the bed, or AA number 3. His name was Bill Dodson. This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was an occasional heartwarming success. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time, right? So the first AA group was formed, but nobody really knows. They're just people that are meeting up and hanging out and trying to help each other get sober, right? So Bill Wilson goes back to New York City after spending an extended amount of time in Akron. It says a second small group promptly took shape at New York, to be followed in 1937 with the start of a third in Cleveland, right? So Cleveland's nearby to Akron, and there was some people traveling back and forth. And the next thing you know, a group starts up in Cleveland as well. Besides these, there were scattered alcoholics who had picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York, who were trying to form groups in other cities. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholics. So they're sitting around and they're going, they're kind of counting up how many people are sort of getting some sobriety behind them, right? And some time in. And they start to realize that maybe something special is happening, right? They're starting to count up, and we've got, a number of people that are staying sober. And so they start to think that, maybe they're really, really onto something that might be really useful. So it was now time, the struggling group thought, to place their message and unique experience before the world. The determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume. The membership had then reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless, now began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. The flying blind period ended and AA entered a new phase of its pioneering time, right? So imagine, y'all know the game where you have a big long line of people and somebody starts at one end and gives a message and it gets passed down the line. And when it gets to the last person, I think the game's called telephone. And when it gets to the last person, the message is rarely anywhere close to what it started off as. So imagine that this small group of people, starting with two and then growing over a couple year period, have this formula that seems to be working and people are getting sober, but it's all by word of mouth, right? And as it grows, that message, isn't consistent, right? So we say that this book was written by the first 100 people because they realized that they needed to get these steps in this program of action into written word so that there was as a reference, right? It's like we call it a textbook, or it's there for future reference. And so they took on this undertaking of writing this book, and they would, Bill Wilson was the primary author, but he would write and send it out, and everyone would review it and give their comments, right? And they would argue about it, and they would fight over it and struggle through it, and then finally agree, right? And so this book was really, really written, we say, by the first 100 sober people. So anytime I think I know better, I'm arguing against those first 100 people, right? And so I'm not smarter than those first 100 people. I can't even imagine when I read this book that the longest people sober at that time was they're writing this book were sober 2.5 years, and they managed to publish and write and publish this book, right? Like, it's a miracle to me. It's absolutely a miracle that all of this information came together and then was written by these people that were relatively new to sobriety, and it be as effective as it is, right? So anytime I think I know better and I want to disagree with something in this book, I'm going against those first 100 people. But now, this book gets published, and there was some debate and some discussion over what to call it. And eventually, there's rumors and discussions about, it was going to be called A Way Out, but there was a whole bunch of books called A Way Out already. And, all these different titles. And eventually they came up with Alcoholics Anonymous. And up to that time, our society didn't have a name. We were known as the drunk squad of the Oxford group and stuff. But our name really comes from the title of the book, not the other way around, right? The book wasn't named after our society or our group. It came from the title of the book, right? And so we call that the flying blind period, where we're just running around. Original old AA used some parts of some of a different book that they studied quite a bit. During that time period, they read the book of James, First Corinthians, and Sermon on the Mount were all a big part of the AA world at that time, until and then this book was published, right? And then this became our textbook, right? We call it a textbook. So does that make sense to everyone? I feel like I've rambled on about this for a long time now, so sorry. I love the history of AA. I'm sorry. Because I truly believe it's a miracle that it came together and that we're all here. So that was the flying blind period, right? So with the appearance of the new book, a great deal began to happen. Dr. Harry Emerson Fosdick, the noted clergyman, reviewed it with approval. In the fall of 1939, Fulton Ausler, the editor of Liberty, printed a piece in his magazine called Alcoholics and God. This brought a rush of 800 frantic inquiries into the little New York office, which meanwhile had been established. Each inquiry was painstakingly answered. Pamphlets and books were sent out, right? So, keep in mind, back in, no internet, right? telephone calls, long distance was very expensive. Telephones were unreliable. You know, there's a lot of this is being done by letter. This article comes out, people see it, and they start flooding this little office with letters, right? And they're sitting in this very understaffed office, you know, trying to answer all of these letters, right? Because people are desperate and they're trying to help them. Businessmen traveling out of existing groups were referred to these prospective newcomers, right? So as businessmen who were sober, you know, some of them were traveling around the US, and when they've got inquiries and letters from a certain area, you know, if somebody's in that area, they're trying to meet up with people and to help get them started, right? New groups started up, and it was found to the astonishment of everyone that AA's message could be transmitted in the mail as well as by word of mouth. By the end of 1939, it was estimated that 800 alcoholics were on their way to recovery. So the book gets published and things start to take off, right? Before the book gets published, AA growth is painfully slow, right? And then we're going to see that it's been the same worldwide. As the book gets published in other languages, other countries are start going through that same growth period that early AA in North America happened. They go through the exact same process where in language or in countries that speak other languages, there's very, very painfully slow growth. And then the book gets translated and growth takes off in those countries once this book becomes available in other languages. So we're up to 800 people here by the end of 1939 that are, you know, well on their way to recovery. In the spring of 1940, John D. Rockefeller Jr. gave a dinner for many of his friends, to which he invited AA members to tell their stories. News of this got on the world wires, inquiries poured in again, and many people went to the bookstores to get the book Alcoholics Anonymous. So Rockefeller is going to throw this dinner for all of his wealthy friends and have members of AA come and be there, you know, one at each table, I think, and to be there to talk about AA. And Bill Wilson, the promoter, thinks that, you know, Rockefeller is gonna finally help with the financial difficulties that AA is in, and, you know, big things are going to start to happen. They wanted to build hospitals, and they wanted to publish a book, and they wanted to have professional 12-steppers. And they have this this big you know, this big dinner, and Rockefeller is brilliantly realizes that money will ruin this thing and says that no, and he gives them a small stipend that that helps a little bit with just day-to-day living for Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, I believe. But he Rockefeller absolutely understands that if AA has a whole pocket full of money, that it's going to ruin this thing, right? And so he brilliantly doesn't fund the entire thing, which leads to the only thing AA could afford to do was eventually publish this book, right? So they have this dinner though, but that really raises awareness about the whole thing, right? So by March 1949, the membership has shot up to 2,000. So it's rapidly growing, right? Then Jack Alexander wrote a feature article in the Saturday Evening Post and placed such a compelling picture of AA before the general public that alcoholics in need of help really deluged us. By the close of 1941, AA numbered 8,000 members. The mushrooming process was in full swing. AA had become a national institution, right? So the Saturday Evening Post has this guy that writes articles named Jack Alexander. And Jack Alexander basically goes out and writes hit pieces on things. And he is sent out to write this article about, you know, how this AA thing must be a fake and a fraud. And he goes out and he spends a bunch of time with AA people and realizes that it's for real, and writes this article that is this really compelling article. And Rob's posted a link to it in the chat. But you know, it's easy to find. There's an AA pamphlet that has it. There is you can find it online in a number of places, and it's a really good article. But the original intention was Rob Alexander was going to go out and prove that AA was some kind of scam, right? And ends up writing this very compelling article all about AA and what a wonderful institution it is. So again, that leads to more publicity for AA and more people finding out about it and more growth, right? So it says our society then entered a fearsome and exciting adolescent period, right? We had a flying blind period, right? We have the early years. We have this, you know, and now that it's starting to grow and mushroom, and it's, you know, 16 years old by the time the second edition is published. And so we're going into these adolescent years, they call it. And we're going to see that AA went through a lot of problems, right? There's a lot of things happening you know, this our new society had to deal with. And out of that come our traditions. And that's really our traditions are born out of early AA when we started having difficulties about, you know, who do we let in, right? How do we decide if someone's allowed into AA, or, you know, how do we fund AA? How do we, you know, they've tried being associated with different things out there, and you know, what were those experiences? And it was really through these early years of AA where we stumbled along and stubbed our toe a little bit on some different things that caused problems within AA that led to the birth of the traditions, and how we can live, you know, the traditions are really about how do we get along as a group, right? How do we live together? And so you know, the society entered the fearsome, exciting adolescent period. The test that it faced was this: could these large numbers of erstwhile erratic alcoholics successfully meet and work together? Would there be quarrels over membership, leadership, and money? Would there be strivings for power and prestige? Would there be schisms which would split us AA apart? Soon AA was beset by all these very problems on every side and in every group. But out of the frightening and at first disrupting experience, the conviction grew that AAs had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene, right? So has anybody ever heard of the Washingtonians? Did anybody ever hear about those in AA? Right? So the Washingtonians were this group that in early history, well, not early history, but in the 1800s, they actually were having some very good success with helping people get sober, and they had a good number of sober people around. And then I always remember sort of what the time frame was, because I know part of what led to their demise. And because they were able to help people with their alcoholism, they thought they should be able to help people with a lot of things. And one of their big demises was they got into the whole discussion of slavery and you know, slavery, you know, and just got involved in things outside of solving alcoholism. And once they did that, they lost their singleness of purpose, and very quickly the Washingtonians disappeared, right? They were really onto something, and very quickly they disappeared off the landscape, right? And it was because they started to be involved in outside issues, right? So that was where some of our traditions came from, right? And why we have this singleness of purpose, and why we don't have opinion on outside matters, right? And why we focus on what we do and only what we do, right? So that it's examples like that, you know, the money thing, you know, being self-sufficient, right? You know, our traditions came from trial and error, right? They came from they weren't just something that somebody sat down and decided we should do. They were born out of trial and error within the groups and within AA, right? Uh yeah, so we had to hang together or die separately. We had to unify our fellowship or pass off the scene, like the Washingtonians. As we discovered the principles by which the individual alcoholic could live, right? There are 12 steps, are the principles by which we can live as individuals. So we had to evolve principles by which the AA groups and AA as a whole could survive and function effectively, right? And that's what the traditions are about. It was thought that no alcoholic man or woman could be excluded from our society, that our leaders might serve but never govern, that each group was to be autonomous, and there was to be no professional class of therapy. I would say if I had to pay someone to hear my fifth step, that would that would I probably would have died by now, because there was no way I was going to pay somebody to hear that. Right? It's hard enough to do on its own. My first one, anyways. There was to be no fees or dues. Our expenses were to be met by our own voluntary contributions. There was to be the least possible organization, even in our service centers. Our public relations were to be based upon attraction rather than promotion. it was decided that all members ought to be anonymous at the level of press, radio, TV, and films, and in no circumstances should we give endorsements, make alliances, or enter public controversies, right? So that's a summary of our traditions, isn't it? Right? And that's what we're talking about here, having gone through the adolescent years. You know, and has anybody ever heard what is it, Rule 62? Right? Anybody ever heard of Rule 62? Right? So it came that they asked all of the different groups to send in all their rules that they had to be a member of the group. And they compiled all of those rules, and there were 61 rules, and they realized that if any one group adopted all 61 of those rules, not a single person would be allowed to be a member of AA. And that's when they came up with Rule 62, which was don't take ourselves so damn seriously, right? And so that's what that was all about. So, you know, that was a nice summary of the traditions. So at the bottom of page XIX, it says, this was the substance of AA's 12 traditions, which are stated in full on page 562 of this book. Did you guys know that there's a long version of the traditions? Like there's the 12 by 12 book, but in the back of this book, there's, you know, the 12 traditions as we know them, but there's also a long version of the 12 traditions, which are interesting. I've not read them lots, but I read them not too long ago. Though none of these principles had the force of rules or laws, they had become so widely accepted by 1950 that they were confirmed by our first international conference held in Cleveland. Today, the remarkable unity of AA is one of the greatest assets that our society has. So they published these traditions, right? Then at the very first World Conference held in 1950 in Cleveland, right near the birthplace of AA, they adopted these traditions. Everyone realizes that the next World Conference is in Vancouver this summer, I'm sure. But in 1950, they adopt these traditions. Now they're not, nobody can make us follow them. Nobody can make us adhere to them. We can break them all we want, right? But I can tell you from my experiences, you know, has anybody ever been a member of a group or in an area where, you know, I was early in sobriety, and the place I got sober in wasn't a very big place, and there was a treatment center there. And there became a rift between the treatment center and AA. And so there was a lot of running around trying to figure out what we were going to do about it. Meetings were being held. How do we deal with it? And our DCM went to you know, somebody that they knew, one of their contacts from out of town, and that person said, you know, how are you bringing the traditions into this? And she came back, and we had one more meeting with all the groups and talked about the traditions. And it was amazing how the problem was solved almost instantly, right? It was once you bring the traditions into any kind of problem within the groups or AA as a whole, my experience has been more than once that the traditions will solve that problem if we remember to bring those into that situation, right? The traditions are there for that very reason. And it's the only time I've ever seen problems happen within groups and that type of stuff is when we're not adhering to the traditions, or we're not, and nobody says we have to, right? They're not laws, they're not rules. We can't get kicked out if we don't follow them. As a group, we can do whatever we want as long as we're not harming AA as a whole, right? But I think that time and time again, the experience has taught us that you know, the traditions are what keep us together. So while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were two principal reasons: the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. These made their impression everywhere, right? So, you know, AA is growing now through this adolescent period exponentially, right? It's growing rapidly. And they're saying you know, there's two big reasons for this. You know, there's the large number of recoveries and reunited homes. Families are being healed, right? Families are getting fixed. Families are coming back together, and people are getting sober. So it said this made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapse, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings, at first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. So I love this part, right? And these stats, and I'm going to say something controversial a little bit. I believe we still have the exact same stats. But the part I missed every time I read it was who really tried, right? So I believe that of those who come to AA and really try, 50% of those people get sober right away. 25% relapse, and after they come back, they get sober, and the remainder show improvement. It also says other thousands came to a few AA meetings, and at first they decided didn't want our program. Like how often does that happen? But here's where I'm going to tell you what I believe the difference between then and now is. It's that part of the number of people who really tried. When they first came to early AA, they came, it was in somebody's house and somebody found out about it. They came to a meeting and they weren't asked to share. Nobody cared what their opinion was of how they thought they needed to get sober. They were there and they were taught what's now in this book, right? And so if they stuck around, they really tried. I think what happens now, and this is the part, like I love to challenge people in your home groups when you have business meetings. I think a fantastic topic is when we have a newcomer throw up through our door, how are we going to deal with them? Because newcomers come, and back in these days, they were going out looking for drunks to help, right? We have them show up on our doorstep. They show up at our doorstep and we say things like, well, if they want help, they'll ask for it, right? It's up to them to reach out. And I believe that them reaching out is when they walk through that door. And it's up to us then to try and make it easy for them, right? I can tell you, and that's based on my experience of being the new guy. I went to these meetings in this really wonderful place that I love it there with a passion. I get to go back in May this year for their roundup, and I'm excited to go back to where my AA roots are. But I spent the first couple of weeks going to meetings there, and they would read this thing called How It Works out of this book that I didn't understand if it was called the Big Book or the Blue Book. I didn't know how it works. It came out of that book. I didn't know what a sponsor was. I didn't know what a home group was. I didn't know any of that stuff. And I just wallowed around in AA for a little while. And I think that we should, and I mean, Shiva will tell you at our home group, when there's a new person shows up, if you're not sitting closest to them, you're not going to be the first one talking to them after the meeting, right? So, we have a very definite plan that of how we want to treat newcomers, because we don't want them getting out of there without feeling welcome, without being able to ask any questions that they have. Maybe without us, I mean, we really don't want them leaving without a sponsor or a temporary sponsor. So, I think having a plan on how to deal with newcomers and then make it as easy as possible for them to really try, right? I don't think we make it easy enough for them to really try. And if we break down those barriers for them, I think we'll see our overall stats going up, right? I think we'll start to see numbers like we used to see. We just have to make it easy for them to really try. And that's the line I missed in this description all the time. I used to say 75% of people used to get sober, and now it's like 5 or 8, something like that, right? Whatever the number is. And I think the stats are still the same for those who really try. It's our job to make it easy for them to really try. Because when you used to go to a meeting in 1935, you were in a house and they took you upstairs in Dr. Bob's house, and they went through the first 3 steps and they prayed with you on your knees, and you came downstairs having gone through those first 3 steps when you were ready to do it. And you were never asked to share about what you learned somewhere else outside of AA, right? So that's my soapbox speech. I'm done. That's it. I get off on a tangent on that one all the time. But great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3 began to return as time passed. Another reason for the wide acceptance of AA was the ministration of friends in medicine, religion, and the press, together with innumerable others who became our able and persistent advocates. Without such support, AA could have made only the slowest progress. Some of the recommendations of AA's early medical and religious friends will be found further on in the book, right? In the back of the book, there's the medical estimate, and there's there's just in the appendixes, there's some information on that. So Alcoholics Anonymous is not a religious organization. Neither does AA take any particular medical point of view, though we cooperate widely with men in medicine as well as with men in religion, right? We are a spiritual program. Many of us within AA do belong to religious organizations. It doesn't matter to us what your that's your own personal business, I guess, is what I'm saying. But we are a spiritual organization, and we're not affiliated with any church or outside religion, right? Alcohol being no respecter of persons, we are an accurate cross-section of America. And in distant lands, the same democratic evening up process is now going on. By personal religious affiliations, we include Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Hindus, and a sprinkling of Muslims and Buddhists. More than 15% of us are women. So again, this is, still early AA. It's starting to grow across the world, but they said alcoholism has no prejudice, right? Alcoholism doesn't care about sex, religion, race, social background, education, none of that, right? Like alcoholism is the great equalizer. It affects all walks of life. At present, our membership is pyramiding at the rate of about 20% a year. So far, upon the total problem of several million actual and potential alcoholics in the world, we have made only a scratch. In all probability, we shall never be able to touch more than a fair fraction of the alcohol problem in all its ramifications. Upon therapy for the alcoholic himself, we surely have no monopoly. Yet it is our great hope that all those who have as yet found no answer may begin to find one in the pages of this book and will presently join us on the high road to a new freedom, right? We don't claim to have the only solution, but we know that I know this is the only solution that works for me. And, if you find another way, good for you, right? So any questions or comments on that part? Does anybody have anything they'd like to add? No? Okay, well, let's carry on. As you'll see, the forward to the third edition is much shorter, right? Forward to the third edition. By March 1976, when this edition went to the printer, the total worldwide membership of Alcoholics Anonymous was conservatively estimated at more than 1 million, with almost 28,000 groups meeting in over 90 countries, right? So look at how fast and how large AA has grown now by 1976, right? Over 1 million recovered alcoholics now, and in over 90 countries. Surveys of groups in the United States and Canada indicate that AA is reaching out not only to more and more people, but to wider and wider range. Women now make up more than 1/4 of the membership. Among newer members, the proportion is nearly 1/3. 7% of AAs surveyed are less than 30 years of age, among them many in their teens, right? So the very first alcoholics in the early days were all middle-aged men, middle-aged white men for the most part, really, right? And then, one of the original titles for the book was The First 100 Men, except then they had one woman, so that didn't work anymore, right? And so as you can see, as time's going on, it's starting to spread through the fabric of society, right? It's spreading to, and younger people, right? More and more women, and it's starting to spread, as it's just starting to grow. The basic principles of the AA program, it appears, hold good for individuals with many different lifestyles, just as the program has brought recovery to those of many different nationalities. The 12 steps that summarize the program may be called Los 12 Pasos in one country, Les 12 Etapas in another, but they trace exactly the same path to recovery that was blazed by the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have a friend, I knew a guy one time that did a 12-step or did a big book study in South America somewhere, and it was his book was in English and everybody else's book was in another language. And the page numbers that we all know where our favorite things are on, they were different page numbers in that book because it was in a different language. So the page numbers weren't identical in the translations. In spite of the great increase in the size and the span of this fellowship, at its core, it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope, right? And that's how we start with a newcomer, right? One-on-one. So that was the forward to the third edition of the book that came out in 1976. So now here's the forward to the fourth edition, which, is the most recent edition, although the fifth one is coming soon, I believe. If it's not out already, I don't believe it is, but it's coming soon, right, Rob? Supposedly. Supposedly it's coming soon. Forward to the fourth edition. This fourth edition of Alcoholics Anonymous came off the press in November 2001 at the start of a new millennium. Since the third edition was published in 1976, worldwide membership of AA has just about doubled to an estimated 2 million or more, with nearly 100,800 groups meeting in approximately 150 countries around the world, right? So it's doubled since the third edition. Anybody have any idea what the numbers are today? Keep in mind, this was 19, when did this come out? Since the third edition was published in 1936. Anybody have any ideas on where it's at?
Yeah, the last figure I have is there's 123,000 AA groups around the world, and there are approximately 2 million
Right.
members.
So since the third edition, when and the fourth edition, we've leveled out at 2 million people. We sell 1 million copies of this book a year. Do you remember when we sold 300,000 copies of this book and we had 150,000 recovered people? Why don't we have millions and millions and millions of recovered alcoholics anymore, right? And it comes back to that and really tried statement to me. We've let too much outside stuff creep into Alcoholics Anonymous. Before the fourth edition was published and in the early days, the 12 by 12 is a wonderful book with wonderful information. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have a single instruction on how to do the steps. It expands on the steps, and people are trying to oh, there's no instruction. I'm getting sober with the 12 by 12. There's nothing I have to do. I'm going to read this book and maybe recovery will rub off on me, right? We didn't used to have treatment centers, and treatment centers, again, are wonderful, wonderful places, but they learn a lot about, in most treatment centers, they talk about and learn about treating our external condition, the things around us that are impacting us and affecting us. But AA is an inside job, right? AA talks about my internal condition, changes my internal condition, and I grow a connection with God through AA, right? And so we have all these outside influences that have crept into AA, and Kevin would talk disparagingly about the three, what does he call them, 3-topic disgusting meetings, not discussion meetings, but the 3-topic disgusting meetings, right? And let's talk about who's got a topic, and 90% of the time it's gratitude, and the other 2 topics are my broken lawnmower and my divorce from 15 years ago, right? And nobody, and not the program of recovery, right? And so that's, I think a lot of that stuff has maybe crept into AA, right? And so I like to focus on the big book and the instructions in here, and making sure that we're talking about a message of recovery in meetings. I thought I was done with the soapbox thing, but I guess not. I'm back on it. So that's the forward to the third edition, the forward to the fest. So we're stuck and leveled off at 2 million people for decades now, right? So those of us that are interested in learning what's in this book, we're the ones that have to lead the way in helping people, and teaching this to others. Kevin says the purpose of this book study is to get other people teaching it to other people, right? That's what our purpose is. So thank you for being willing to do that. So literature has played a major role in AA's growth, and a striking phenomena of the past quarter century has been the explosion of translations of our basic literature to many languages and dialects. In country after country where the AA seed was planted, it has taken root slowly at first, then growing by leaps and bounds when literature has become available, right? That's what I was saying earlier, is the seed gets planted. There's it's very painful, slow growth. The book gets translated, and then it explodes in people that speak that language, right? Much like here, when when it was painfully slow growth, and then the first book was published, and then it started to grow. Currently, Alcoholics Anonymous has been translated into 43 languages. It's many, many more than that now. It says in 1921 at the bottom, Alcoholics Anonymous is in 73 languages, right? So, 4 years ago, we were up to 73 languages that this book has been translated into. As the message of recovery has reached larger numbers of people, it has also touched the lives of a vastly greater variety of suffering alcoholics. When the phrase, "we are people who normally would not mix," on page 17 of this book was written in 1939, it referred to a fellowship composed largely of men and a few women with quite similar social, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. Like so much of AA's basic text, those words have proved to be far more visionary than the founding members could have ever imagined. The stories added to this edition represent a membership whose characteristics of age, gender, race, and culture have widened and have deepened to encompass virtually everyone the first 100 members could have hoped to reach, right? So the stories in the back of the book, you know, however many there are now, those stories in each edition, you know, we read earlier how they've changed. Some have been taken out, some have moved around, some have been rewritten. But the idea of those stories in the back of the book, you know, there's the 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 idea is that as society has changed, or as AA's membership has changed and society has changed over the years, let's have stories in the back of the book that are relevant to today, right? And so that when someone picks up this book and they start reading those stories in the back of the book, hopefully they identify with somebody, right? Hopefully there's somebody back there that they identify with and go, oh, that makes sense. That I see myself in them, right? And so that's why they changed the stories in the back of the book with each edition. You know, as the membership started to change and there was more and more women and there was, you know, more people of different ethnicities and backgrounds and all of that, right? So while our literature has preserved the integrity of a message, right, from the telephone game that we were talking about, there is this, you know, this part that has the actual message of recovery in it. It says sweeping changes in society as a whole are reflected in new customs and practices within the fellowship. Taking advantage of technological advances, for example, AA members with computers can participate in meetings online, sharing with fellow alcoholics across the country or around the world. In any meeting anywhere, AA share experience, strength, and hope with each other. In order to stay sober and to help other alcoholics, modem to modem or face to face, AA speak the language of the heart in all its power and simplicity, right? I love this part that way back in the forward to the 4th edition, they said modem to modem, right? I can't tell you how many meetings I was in and how many times it came up during COVID that we can't be online. That's blowing our anonymity, and that's just not understanding what an anonymity is all about. And this brought AA closer together. Like okay, we're gonna do Kevin's thing where we're gonna go around and see where everyone's from, right? And because of COVID, we got to learn about Zoom, and we got to the fellowship has never been stronger, I don't think, right? So with that, we will leave off there, ready for the doctor's opinion next week. I'm going to be quiet-ish. Um, Kevin likes to close